Welcome to Key Talking Points.
The podcast that makes learning effortless.
No fluff, no jargon, just clear, engaging explanations.
We break down complex topics so you don't have to.
Let's get straight to the point.
Visit keytalkingpoints.com for more. All right, let's dive into the latest attempt at diplomacy in the ongoing Ukraine conflict. So, there's this US proposed 30-day ceasefire, and at first glance, it sounds like a step towards peace. But, as usual, there's a lot more going on beneath the surface.
Exactly. On paper, a ceasefire certainly gives the impression of progress, doesn't it? Yet, Vladimir Putin's agreement to the proposal is, well, it's conditional. He's being careful to emphasize that discussions are needed to iron out the details, as he puts it.
Right. And let's not ignore the timing here. Russia's military has been stepping up pressure, especially in the Kursk region. I mean, this move by Putin feels like it's as much about maintaining an upper hand as it is about diplomacy.
True. He's also framed this as a path to lasting peace. Which sounds noble, but let's be honest, it's really about securing strategic advantages, isn't it? There's already talk of whether Ukraine could use this pause to rearm, which I suspect plays a big role in Putin's apparent hesitation.
Oh, absolutely. And then there's Zelenskyy. He hasn't minced words about this, has he? On Telegram, he called out Russia for dragging its feet on this whole thing, labelling it as a stalling tactic.
And to be fair, Ukraine has every reason to be wary. We've seen how ceasefires can be exploited in the past. One side repositions, regroups, and then we're back to square one, possibly worse off than before.
Uh-huh. And this reminds me so much of the Vietnam War negotiations. Do you remember the endless back and forths about ceasefires then?
Oh, absolutely. Those talks were riddled with the same kind of diplomatic manoeuvring. Both sides would agree in principle. But the practicalities, they would always be a sticking point. It was all about optics at the time, a way to buy time or sway international opinion.
Exactly. You know, it's almost eerie how history echoes, isn't it? You've got public promises, private doubts, and military activity that never really stops. It's like the playbook hasn't changed all that much.
It hasn't, and I think that's the heart of the issue. Everyone's positioning for what comes next. For Russia, it's about maintaining leverage. For Ukraine, it's about survival. And for the US, well, it's walking that fine line between being a mediator and a stakeholder.
Exactly. And these dynamics, they're just so intricate, aren't they? All right, let's press pause on that for a second, because this next bit is where it really gets technical.
Exactly. And speaking of intricate dynamics, let's zero in on Putin's insistence on compliance mechanisms. This has become a major sticking point, hasn't it? He's been very vocal about the need for a reliable framework to monitor violations, which ties directly into maintaining leverage on the global stage.
That's right. And, you know, his argument isn't entirely unfounded. Ceasefires, historically, have been fragile without a strong system to enforce them. It's always too easy for either side to claim the other broke the truce first, and then we're back to conflict.
Exactly, and he's already floated concerns about Ukraine potentially using the ceasefire as an opportunity to rearm. I mean, you can see why he'd want mechanisms in place, but also it feels like he's preparing his narrative, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And let's not forget, meanwhile, the US is playing a pretty interesting hand. On one end, they're emphasizing a diplomatic path, but on the other, they've resumed military support to Ukraine. That dual approach is tricky.
Oh, for sure. It raises so many questions about interest, doesn't it? Are they fully invested in peace, or is this a form of leverage? You've got to wonder how the two strategies are balancing out behind closed doors.
It does seem conflicted, doesn't it? And all this is playing out while Sudzha becomes a focal point. You've got this town, strategically significant, right there on the border, with both military and symbolic value.
Yeah, I mean, Sudzha's been described as a flashpoint, hasn't it? A key target for both sides. And then you've got the Russian claims about driving out Ukrainian forces, which, of course, haven't been independently verified.
And those claims themselves highlight another issue: information control. Both sides are spinning narratives to suit their objectives, making it harder to get a clear picture of what's actually happening on the ground.
Totally. It's like chess, isn't it? Claiming territory isn't just about military gain, it's about posture, about shaping perceptions ahead of negotiations. And Sudzha, as a kind of bargaining chip, really underscores how tactical this all is.
Absolutely. And it shows that even while all these talks of ceasefire are happening, the conflict itself is far from paused. Sudzha is proof of that. There's so much riding on how any agreement might take shape.
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Can the parties establish a framework robust enough to hold this time? Every past attempt has fallen apart, so what's different now?
And speaking of frameworks, Ukraine has raised some pretty valid concerns about what this ceasefire might actually lead to, hasn't it?
Exactly. There's this prevailing fear that rather than de-escalating the conflict, it might just give Russia the breathing space to regroup and rearm. And honestly, it's not the first time we've seen ceasefires used in this way.
Right. If history's taught us anything, it's that these pauses can sometimes be anything but productive. You know, instead of lasting peace, it's like a chance for one side to strengthen their position and reset the board.
Absolutely. And it's not just Ukraine watching closely. The global community will be key in holding both sides accountable. This is where organisations like the UN, or even non-NATO allies, could potentially play an essential role in ensuring integrity.
But here's the catch. Trust. And I mean, honestly, how do you negotiate peace when trust between leaders is practically non-existent? Zelenskyy calls out Putin for stalling. Putin accuses Ukraine of ulterior motives.
And it's not just the leaders, is it? Public perception matters massively too. Both in Ukraine and Russia, people are forming opinions based on what they're being told. And, how much their access to unbiased information is limited.
Totally. It's interesting to see how much of this is also about shaping narratives. You've got leaders walking this tightrope, balancing their military strategies with keeping their publics on side. It's exhausting to even think about, let alone live through.
And it's that very balancing act that makes these negotiations so precarious. One wrong move, and the whole thing crumbles. So, global actors watching this, they have their work cut out for them to ensure there's no tipping point.
Well, on that note, I guess we'll have to leave it here for today. This ceasefire conversation, it's a layered one full of diplomatic twists and turns. But hopefully, we've unpacked enough to make sense of it all.
We certainly gave it a shot. And really, it's a story that's far from over. But understanding these dynamics is crucial, not just for the leaders involved, but for all of us watching from the sidelines.
Exactly. And with so many layers still unfolding, we're in for quite the journey ahead. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, stay curious and take care.